Good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Berthiaume. I coach at Woodward Academy in Atlanta, Georgia, and this summer I teach one of the Hoya Spartan labs. So we've been working on the topic for about 3 weeks now at Georgetown, and now we're here at SDI. And this morning I'm going to talk to you about the topic, sort of give you an overview of the topic. And we're going to start with two very brief video clips that I think help frame some things for my lecture. So they both start right away, so just make sure you're listening right when I hit play. Okay. Turn up the sound.
But we're going to be cutting tremendous amounts of money and waste and fraud and abuse. You know, they had a case.
Would you cut departments?
No, I'm not cutting services, but I'm cutting spending. But I may cut Department of Education. I believe Common Core is a very bad thing. I believe that we should be, educating our children from Iowa, from New Hampshire, from South Carolina, from California, from New York. I think that it should be local education. If you look at a Jeb Bush and some of these others, they want them to be educated by Washington, D.C. bureaucrats. So Department of Education is one. Environmental protection, what they do is...
All right, you then want to talk about other things. So that's the first one. The second one is perhaps the worst debate moment involving the Department of Education, maybe ever. This is Rick Perry. Who knows who Rick Perry is now? Who's Rick Perry? Yeah. Anybody? Shout it out. What do we got? Way in the back.
He's the Energy Secretary?
Yes. This was when he was running for president, and this was in 2011. He was running the 2012 Republican primary. So we're gonna watch this briefly. It's not very long.
And I'll tell you, it's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see. Oh, 5, okay. So commerce, education, and
EPA?
EPA, there you go. Okay.
Seriously? Is EPA the one you're talking about?
No, sir. No, sir. We're talking about the agencies of government. EPA needs to be rebuilt.
But you can't name the third one?
The third agency of government, yeah. I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry. Oops.
Okay, so I like both of those because I think they sort of frame the debate that we are talking about this year. We are having a debate resolution that centers around an agency that the president has suggested eliminating, a Department of Education that the president suggested on the campaign trail that he would eliminate. It seems like that's probably not what's going to happen. But as you can see in both the clip from Donald Trump, President Trump, and the clip from Rick Perry, the Department of Education and the federal role in education is extremely controversial. And there is an open debate, especially on the Republican side, about whether there should be a federal role in education at all. So as we sort of go through both sort of the definitions and topic side or the resolution side of this, and also the sort of historical side of this, I want you to be thinking about 2 things in your mind. Keep 2 sort of meta questions in your mind. The first is, what is the federal role in education and how has that changed over time? Because that sort of sets the scene for what we're going to be talking about this year. And the second is, why is that role so controversial? Why is there so much disagreement about what the federal role in education should be? So, here's our resolution for this year. The United States federal government should substantially increase its funding and/or regulation of elementary and/or secondary education in the United States. And I think it helps to understand the resolution to sort of break down the context of some of the terms in the resolution to give you sort of some idea of what we're going to be talking about this year. So the first word I want to talk about is funding. Funding. Funding means pretty much what you think it means. It means money. The debate about what the word funding means, as opposed to other similar words that sort of sound colloquially like synonyms, is about whether funding includes things like tax credits. And there are a number of education proposals that center around the idea of giving a credit for education rather than increasing funding directly. And so if you are one of the people who last night started taking a look at that topicality file, you will notice that there is a debate about whether funding includes tax credits or whether it is just money. And I think probably it comes down a little bit on the side of money. The important thing to understand here is that when we're talking about funding, the percentage of funding allocated by the federal government to education is relatively small. It is about 10% of education funding in the United States is given by the federal government. There's a range, okay? From year to year it varies, and it also just depends a little bit on how you calculate that number. I've seen anywhere from sort of 8% to 13%, but right around 10% comes from the federal government. It's a nice, easy number to remember. And then the rest of it is split pretty equally between states and localities. So it's about 10 from the federal government, 45% state, and 45% local. And that's pretty interesting because, remember, when we're looking at the topic, we are only talking about the federal government increasing its funding. So we're not talking about states or localities increasing their funding, at least not when we're affirmative. And we're really dealing with the 10% of the topic, or 10% of federal funding that is at the federal level. The total funding to education, public education, at the elementary and secondary level in the United States is about $6 billion each year, right around $6 billion. It goes up sometimes, it goes down sometimes, but right around $6 billion total. And again, about 10% federal, 45% local, 45% state. Regulation is the next word, and oh boy do I wish this word was a little bit more precisely defined. Regulation sort of means rules and policies. Some people say it means binding control over something, but that term is not particularly limiting. And what I mean by that is a lot of things count as regulations. Most laws that deal with education qualify as regulations of education. So that means that on the funding side, we're talking about only 10% currently coming from the federal government. On the regulation side of the topic, it's a lot harder to sort of judge exactly how much federal regulation there is now and how much the plan might change that. All right, let's talk about types of education for a minute. Elementary education, you have all completed it. It is generally defined as K-8. Sometimes it's defined as K-6, but it starts in kindergarten and concludes before high school. Definitions of elementary generally exclude preschools and anything before preschool, and that falls under the category of what the federal government refers to as early childhood education. So when we're talking about giving funding or increasing regulation of elementary schools in the United States, we're mostly talking about people right around the age of 5 or 6 when they enter kindergarten up through somewhere between 6th or 8th grade for the elementary area. There are 67,000 public elementary schools in the United States, far more elementary schools than there are any other type of school, 67,000 of them in the U.S. in public schools. Secondary school is either defined as 9 through 12, what you would often call high school, or it's defined as 6 through 12 and sort of swallows up junior high, middle school years. But it is definitely not beyond 12th grade. So between elementary and or secondary, when you're thinking about the boundaries of the topic, we are talking about people from kindergarten through 12th grade and probably not outside those two things. It does not include universities, it does not include community colleges, it's really K through 12. There are 24,000 public secondary schools in the United States, so far fewer public secondary schools than there are public elementary schools. And yet that probably reflects your experience too, where you're probably going to a high school that has more students in it than your elementary school did, and that's true for most places in the United States. Education. So broadly, the most broad understanding of education just means learning, right? We are learning things. You are being educated this morning. I am educating you about the topic. This afternoon you will go to lab where you will be educated about other things at some point. Maybe you'll even be educated about, all the different options in the Brody Calf because you went to the Brody Calf and then you learned what was there and you have been educated. That's a really big interpretation, right? If education just means like anytime anyone learns something, that's a lot of things. A more limiting definition that you'll sometimes see, and this is included in the packet negative, is curriculum or instruction that takes place in schools. Curriculum or instruction that takes place in schools. And so what they're talking about there, there's sort of two parts of that limit. One of them is it has to be in a school, right? You're not just like, going to the Brody Calf then would not count as education because it is not in a school. The other part of that that's a little bit more limiting is that it's not just like resolved, let's talk about schools. It says it might be something like curriculum and instruction in those schools, not just anything about the schools in general. So perhaps changing what types of schools students go to might not count as curriculum or instruction. And you will have a debate in your labs about whether the packet affirmative, which talks about bathroom policies in schools, is a type of education. And the negative will probably say it's not curriculum. The affirmative will say it's definitely part of the school milieu and thus is education. Types of schools. Types of schools. So, some words that are useful to understand when you are talking, when you are reading about the topic. But you'll notice, remember, the topic doesn't say funding and or regulation of public schools, public elementary or secondary schools in the United States. It just says schools. So probably all of these things are included under the sort of category of things that are in the topic. But it's good to know about different types of schools that we have in the United States so that you can understand what you're reading. So public schools are probably what you think they are. They are schools that are funded and run by the government. They're funded, government-funded schools, government-run schools. Most, but not all, public schools you attend based on where you live, and there are some proposals to change that. A private school, or otherwise known as an independent school, is a school that is not run by the government. Some of those schools do get some incidental federal funding, but for the most part, private and independent schools are separate from government-run schools. There are 33,000 elementary and secondary independent schools in the United States. 33,000. They don't break it down really between elementary and secondary, but 33,000 total. Who knows when most of the private and independent schools started in the United States? There was a huge wave of people forming private and independent schools. Who knows when? I want everybody to think about it for a second, then I'll call on somebody. Think about when, think about our nation's history, think about what you know about schools. Think about when you think most private and independent schools opened in the U.S. Okay, you had your hand up super fast, way in the back.
Mid-1960s, late 1960s?
Yeah, and why is that?
Because of desegregation in public.
Absolutely. So there's sort of two waves of independent schools in the United States. There's an early wave that's sort of around 1900-ish. And then there is a much larger wave that started post Brown versus Board of Education. And we'll talk about that in detail in a second. But the idea here is that a lot of schools, private and independent schools, started up when desegregation happened. And families that did not want their children to attend integrated schools decided that their best option, instead of having their kids attend integrated schools, was to have them attend private schools. And we'll talk about the details of that policy and how it worked out in just a minute. Charter schools. A charter school is a public school. It's a public school, and it is publicly funded. And it applies for a charter, that's why it's called a charter school, from the state to run outside of the traditional process. And different states have different rules for their charter schools. But for the most part, charter schools do not have to comply with all of the same requirements that a public school does. If they are a non-profit school, that's a non-profit charter school, they can receive outside funding, so they can get donations. Now, most of them do. Charter schools, though, in the United States can also be run for profit. And so there are some charter school organizations that are businesses the same way a tech company would be a business, or even, you know, the stores you go to are profit businesses. And there are some charter schools that are for profit. Does anyone know where the first charter school was? What state? first charter school in the United States? Anybody have a guess? I know there's at least one person in this room that's from that state. What do you got? Massachusetts. Oh, it's such a good guess. Okay, so my bet is that the reason you guessed Massachusetts, are you from Massachusetts? Yeah. Okay, so my bet is the reason you guessed Massachusetts is because you know that almost everything else in education started in Massachusetts. So if you're looking for the first public school in the United States, it's in Massachusetts. If you're looking for the first teacher education school in the United States, also in Massachusetts. If you're looking for the first time a state passed a law that said every people under a certain age have to go to school, third time's the charm, it's Massachusetts. But charter school is not Massachusetts. It's from my home state of Minnesota in 1991. The first charter state was in Minnesota in 1991. And many charter schools are set to be sort of special schools in that they might have a particular focus. They might focus on kids who were born in poverty. They might focus on science and technology. Some of them are arts focused. There's a lot of different sort of types of charter schools. And when you're looking at charter schools as a category, it's a really diverse category, meaning when you look at public schools, a lot of them obey the same rules and have a lot of similar sort of testing requirements and that sort of thing. When you're looking at charter schools, it's all over the map. There has been, so since that first charter school in Minnesota in 1991, there has been an explosion of charter schools in the United States. The most recent figures from the government is there are about 6,800 of them in the United States. 6,800 of them. But I would keep an eye on that number. I'm willing to bet you that that number will go up by the end of the topic. And if I were to give this topic lecture a year from today, I'd be saying a number that's in the 7,000s or the 8,000s. They're really expanding quickly. Okay, a fourth type of school is called a magnet school. Does anyone attend a magnet school? Anyone go, oh, we got some in the back. Can you tell me what a magnet school is?
Kids from all over the city and region.
Yeah, absolutely. So a bunch of you probably go to public schools, and the school that you go to is determined by where you live. So if you live in one district in this area, you might go to Lansing High School, and if you live in another district, you go to Okemos High School. But if you go to a magnet school, it is a school where it draws from a larger area, and it draws across traditional district lines or traditional school zone lines. And a lot of them have specialty courses. So the reason you might go to a magnet school is that it has different course offerings than at the local public school. Some of them, there's a lot of science and technology focused ones. There are some that are arts focused. If you're in Minnesota, there's a zoo school, magnet school, that's pretty cool, where you like do your schooling in conjunction with the Minnesota Zoo. I had a friend who went there. It was exactly as cool as you would think that would be. But the idea is that specialty schools that are still public schools and still have to follow the same public school rules might have a focus that draws people from a larger area. Okay, the last category of schools are parochial schools. Parochial schools. This is a subset of private or independent schools that are led by religious organizations. In the United States, most parochial schools are Catholic, but there is a huge diversity after that of what type of parochial schools people attend. So when you're looking at the category of private or independent schools, some of those schools are secular, meaning that they don't have a religious influence, and some of them are non-secular or parochial, and they're religiously affiliated. Okay, so that's sort of the types of schools that we're going to be talking about this year. And we're now going to take a little field trip through the history of U.S. education policy, and I'm going to emphasize little, because when I was trying to decide what to include here, it was so hard to make the cuts, because there are so many things that I think are really interesting in the history of education in the United States, but I'm going to sort of limit this to starting right around 1950 and moving forward from there. Not because there aren't important things that happened before then, but because so many of the things that we're going to be talking about now have their foundations then. So, before we go through individual laws and policies, I wanted to sort of give you an idea of the broad category we're talking about here. So, there are generally 4 historical roles of the federal government in education. Starting from the earliest, the oldest role the federal government had in education is higher education. Higher education. The first thing the federal government did in higher education, remember that's not what we're talking about on the topic this year. Higher education is colleges and universities, community colleges, everything after secondary school. The first sort of role the federal government had there was via land grant colleges. Land grant colleges. When you are looking to go to college in a couple of years, or very soon for some of you, many of you are going to be looking at colleges that were established via land grants from the federal government, where the federal government gave the states some money, and then the states were able to sell that to create their universities. So you are right now on a land grant college. If you go to the University of Georgia or the University of Minnesota or pretty much nearly every school that has University of and then a state name right after it, that's a land grant college. And lots of land grant colleges are also state name and then the word state, okay? So you could look this up if you were curious if a particular school is a land grant college. But the federal government got involved in this relatively early and was to help establish higher education. The second role of the federal government education that came a little bit later, but still quite early, is for national defense needs. So from time to time, the federal government has sort of determined that there was some element of education that maybe wasn't being addressed enough. It just wasn't quite as much as they wanted going on. They needed more people who knew how to do science. They needed more people who knew how to do particular types of technology. They needed just more educated people. And so the federal government has gotten involved in education to sort of shore up national defense. The third role of the federal government in education, and a lot of the specific policies we're going to talk about deal with this because so does the packet affirmative, and that is civil rights or minority group access. Civil rights or minority group access. And starting all the way back right after the Civil War, when the federal government had the Freedmen's Bureau, which included education for people who had been freed from slavery, all the way up through the present day, there are times where the federal government determines that states and localities are not doing a good enough job providing access to particular groups of people. And they determined that they should get involved in order to increase access to underserved groups in education. And we'll look at some examples of that. The most recent role of the federal government education, the thing that the government picked up most recently, is educational quality. And what we mean by that is not just, a particular subset that we might need for national defense or a particular group that's being excluded, but the federal government has become sort of a player in the how good is the education for everyone in the United States, how good are public schools debates. And so that's the most recent role that the federal government has picked up. So as you're looking at the policies that we're about to discuss, both court cases and congressional policies, pretty much all of them fall into one or more of these four categories, and you can kind of get an idea of where we are heading. Okay, so in 1950, the Supreme Court decided two cases. They were released on the same day in 1950. Sweatt v. Painter and McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents. And these are two cases that challenged the idea that separate but equal could ever really be equal. So prior to this, it was acceptable in both higher education and elementary and secondary education to have segregated schools. Most of the time that meant that there was one school for white kids and another school for everybody else. And the idea there was that had been previously upheld by the courts as an appropriate form of education. Well, these two cases in 1950 challenged that at the post-secondary level, at the college or beyond college level. And in those cases, the Supreme Court held that segregated higher education, so past 12th grade, violates the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. What amendment number does the Equal Protection Clause fall under? Who's taking government recently? What do we got? Right over here, yeah. What number? 14th Amendment. 14th Amendment, very important amendment. And these two cases determined that segregated higher education violates that Equal Protection Clause. The court held two things. It said, first, there is no justification for separate but equal. That there's no sort of understanding of separate but equal that makes any sense given that there's a 14th Amendment. And second, those educations that were being provided were not equal. Okay, so that it was sort of two layers to that response. These things are not equal, and even if they were equal, it would still not be okay. So this is a higher education case, not about the lower elementary and secondary education, but this set the stage for Brown versus Board of Education, which happened 4 years later. Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 determined that separate but equal not only is not acceptable in higher education, but is not acceptable in elementary and secondary education either. At the time of Brown versus Board, does anybody know how many states had legally enforced segregation? Does anyone have a guess? What do you got?
11.
11, it's a little more. Who's got another guess?
14.
14, a little bit more. Keep going.
16.
Oh, so close. One more. 17. 17 states had legally enforced segregation policies. But one of the interesting things, or the particularly sad things, is that even though it was only 17 states, we were talking about 40% of public school students in the United States were living in a state with legally enforced segregation. And nearly everyone was going to a school that was not integrated, okay? Whether legally or just de facto. In the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, when the court said those 17 states had to change their laws, there were a bunch of effects that really limited the ability of Brown versus Board of Education to lead to integrated schools. So first, about half of the southern states that this applied to passed laws to revoke licenses of teachers that supported integration. So if you were a teacher, whether you were a teacher at a formerly white school or a formerly non-white school, if you supported integration, revoked your teacher's license. So just trying to make sure that none of the teachers were pro-integration. Second, 7 states repealed teacher tenure provisions. What's tenure? Who can know what tenure is in teaching? Yeah, what do you got?
Tenure.
Say what?
Tenure is when you work long enough that you can't be fired anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not you can't be fired, but it's that after you've been a teacher for a certain amount of time, it is much more challenging to fire you. So if you work for a business or you work for an independent school, they can decide to not renew your contract at any time. If you work in many public school districts, after you have demonstrated for a certain amount of time you're a good teacher, they might give you what is called tenure, and that means that you have some increased job protections. And the idea there is to ensure that schools don't just sort of lay off teachers that have gotten more expensive, right? Because as you get raises over your career, teachers, you would make a little bit more money. And there would otherwise be sort of a financial incentive to lay off the teachers that cost the most. And so tenure is sort of a protection there. And it also, some people say, protects some sort of free speech and independence of education. But in any case, 7 states in the South said, oh dear, tenured teacher protections mean that we have a whole host of black teachers that have tenure. And so what they said is that they were going to repeal tenure laws so that they didn't have to continue to employ black teachers, which was just super devastating to people who had been teaching in previously non-white schools, mostly black teachers in the South, that no longer had tenure so that they could be fired. 4 states ended the right to public education altogether. They said you no longer have a right to public education. Now that doesn't mean they canceled all the schools, right? But it does mean that they said this is no longer guaranteed by our state. Lots of black teachers lost their jobs as integration continued. So there were some circumstances where formerly all-white schools would start to take non-white kids, but they would not take the teachers along with them. And so they were replacing qualified black teachers, highly qualified and educated black teachers, with substantially less qualified white teachers as a result, as sort of they were moving in that direction. So 10 years after Brown v. Board, 90% of Southern black students were still in only black schools. So 90% of kids in the South who were black were not attending a school with any white children. And that includes 100% of black students in Mississippi in 1964 were still attending black schools that did not have any white children, and they were still not attending schools that were integrated. So it's a very slow process. 1965 comes along and Congress gets involved. Congress steps up and they pass the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA. ESEA, this is an important one. ESEA created a federal role in what they call compensatory education. And what that means is that the federal government decided that part of its role in education was to compensate for ways in which states and localities were falling behind. And in particular, in the ESEA, they established what is called Title I, or Title I schools. Who's ever heard of a Title I school? Oh, not very many people. This is good. We're learning things. Can you tell people what a Title I school is, or you're just like, you know what it is, but
People below a certain amount of the poverty line apply to Title I. They have certain tests they
yeah, absolutely. So what Title I said is that the federal government was going to assist with districts or neighborhoods that had a high percentage of students who were living in poverty, and it would assist those schools by giving federal funding to schools where there was a high percentage of kids living in poverty. So if you live in an area where a high percentage of people live in poverty, some of that funding still comes from states and localities, just like that percentage we broke down in the beginning. But in those areas, the federal government spends a lot more in order to sort of compensate for a tax base that might not have as much money. And one of the things that you should know about funding of public schools in the United States is, for the most part, they are funded by property taxes, which means that areas that are wealthier have more wealthy people living in them, and those people tend to have more valuable property, and so they have much higher school funding. And as you will see, that creates some huge inequities in our education in the United States, where areas that are very wealthy have dramatically better public schools than areas that are not, because they literally have a higher tax base. So the federal government got involved here, and federal assistance focused on the most disadvantaged students. And to make sure that states weren't going to just sort of slack off in this category, it required states to match the funding. So it said, states, we will give you a bunch more money for schools where there are kids living in poverty, but you have to do your part too. You have to match that money. This came about during President Johnson, and President Johnson had a war on something. What did he have a war on? Poverty, war on poverty. The first sort of war on concept. We have the war on terror. Johnson had the war on poverty. And he saw teachers as sort of saviors in the fight against inequality, that he thought education was extremely important as part of his war on poverty. Also under ESEA came Head Start. Who's heard of Head Start? Anyone can tell me what Head Start is? Can you give it a try down front? Oh, yeah, I mean, yes. It is early childhood education for kids who are living in poverty. The idea is literally to give them a head start on going to public school, okay? So that kids who their family would otherwise very much not be able to afford preschool, because right in the United States, mostly we have private preschools, might be eligible for Head Start, where they go to a preschool program to get ready for kindergarten. Okay, move to the 70s. In the 70s, we have a few more cases that have to do with expanding access to disadvantaged groups. So 1971, Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. Anyone from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg area? Do you have any Charlotte kids? No, we didn't at Georgetown either. Okay, so what was happening is, remember, when we were talking about Brown versus Board of Education, we talked about how schools were not integrating, even though they could no longer legally segregate the schools, but the schools were just not integrating. They were doing so by sort of just sitting and waiting and not doing things. And in this case, the court ruled that one tool that might be required in some areas to address illegal segregation of schools is school busing. School busing, in order to address continued segregation of schools. And what that means is that it would take students from one area and send them to a school outside of their neighborhood by literally putting them on a bus and taking a bus to a different neighborhood. Because one of the problems with alleviating the legacy of segregated education And that the reason that segregation continued so dramatically and so horrifically is that it's not just schools that were segregated, it was also neighborhoods, right? A legacy of housing segregation in the United States where people who weren't white weren't able to buy houses in certain neighborhoods means that if you just continue to have schools be by neighborhood, they never get integrated, or at least that's what it seemed like was happening. So in Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, the court said, if you're not integrating your schools, we might have to have court-established busing policies where students will go to schools that are not just their neighborhood school, or otherwise the schools are never going to integrate. This was extremely controversial because there's sort of the legacy of the way education started in the United States is that it started at the locality level, right? Neighborhoods or little towns would decide to establish a school. And a lot of people, both people who were just like, let's be honest, really racist and opposed to integrated schools, used sort of this local school idea to oppose busing as well. 1972 comes along, we got Title IX. Title IX. I'm going to talk about this only briefly because I know Will is going to talk about this in more detail in the second half of the morning. But Title IX prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex in education programs that receive federal funds. So you cannot discriminate on the basis of sex if it is an education program that receives federal funds. There are some exceptions to this, but overall, Title IX dramatically expanded access to programs and especially sports in the United States. There's been a recent, under President Obama, there was a recent sort of expanded use of Title IX to enforce sexual harassment and anti-sexual assault policies, so policies that try to be stricter against sexual assault, mostly on college campuses. But it's sort of unclear how much the Trump administration is going to continue to use Title IX in that way. But that's a sort of expansion of Title IX in the last 10 years or so. 1973, another big case. And this is not our packet affirmative, but it's sort of the second wave affirmative that our lab has been debating, and you'll encounter in the next few days, is about San Antonio Independent School District v. Rodriguez. And it's mostly referred to as the Rodriguez decision because San Antonio Independent School District is really long. So you'll hear Rodriguez or the legacy of Rodriguez. And what happened is that parents, anyone from San Antonio? No? All right. Parents in the San Antonio school districts and neighboring districts sued the state of Texas and their school district and said that wealth-based financing of public education is unconstitutional because poor neighborhoods get much worse schools than rich neighborhoods. We just talked about that. I previewed that for you. But the idea is that if you fund education based on the local tax base and at the local level, then wealthy areas, because they have people with more money and thus contribute more to taxes because they just have more money, are going to get much better schools than poorer neighborhoods. The Supreme Court did not agree with these parents who were concerned about the quality of their kids' schools. They said that because there is not a constitutional right to education, there is no constitutional right to education, school financing then would not be subject to the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. That you do not have an equal right to education because you do not have a right to education. And the fact that most places do have education is a benefit, but you don't get to sue because your education is bad. It was a 5-4 decision. A lot of people think it was a wrong decision, and that's the affirmative that you're going to be looking at in a couple days sort of argues that it was decided wrongly. But it shifted education litigation for the most part to the states. And state courts, because most states, nearly all of them, do have education in their state constitution. Justice Thurgood Marshall dissented in this case. I'm going to read a little line from this because I think it helps you understand just how important this case was to determining what schools look like today. If this case had been decided differently, your schools, if you go to a public school, will be really different. Okay? He said, the majority's holding can only be seen as a retreat from our historic commitment to equality of educational opportunity, and as unsupportable acquiescence in a system which deprives children in their earliest years of the chance to reach their full potential as citizens. Okay? Powerful words. He was extremely angry because he said that by not determining that there is a constitutional right to education and not determining that schools have to provide an equal education, you are guaranteeing that the poorest students are never going to get the education that they deserve. Okay, 1974, along another Supreme Court case, Milliken v. Bradley, known pretty much as Milliken. This is another desegregation case involving the Detroit metropolitan area. So I know we got some Detroit people in here.
Woo!
There we go, thank you. This case, if you attend a public school in Detroit, was probably not that great for you. What it said is that school busing, so remember we talked about busing to increase integration in schools, to eliminate segregated schools, had to stop at a city's borders. And what that means, in effect, is that Detroit had previously had a plan to desegregate schools that involved busing kids between the city itself, like Detroit proper, and surrounding suburban areas. So busing from areas that were majority white into areas that were majority people of color. And instead, the court said, no, none of that. You can only bus within the city itself. And given, remember we talked about housing discrimination a few minutes ago, given how many cities have segregating housing policies, this effectively dramatically reduced the ability of busing policies to integrate between city areas and outlying suburban areas. And in this case, the court determined that the reason to do this was local control. It said local control is an important tradition in education. And so if suburban schools are asked to integrate with city schools, that is no longer local control of education. And so it dramatically reduced the effectiveness of busing policies. 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This is another place where the federal government was getting involved on behalf of a group that had been receiving substandard education, that was neglected in education. And it said at the congressional level that all children are guaranteed a free and appropriate education, known as the FAPE, or FAPE, free and appropriate education, in the least restrictive environment. The least restrictive environment. LRE. What that effectively means is that school districts that have been automatically removing anyone with a physical or learning disability from the general population of students could no longer do that. You can no longer just say that because someone has a learning difference or because someone has a physical challenge, that they don't get to go to school with everybody else. If you are someone who has an IEP, or you know someone who has an IEP, an individual education plan, that came out of this 1975 piece of congressional legislation. And it said that parents get to participate in the process, that students have due process, which means that if you think that you are not receiving a free and appropriate education based on having a learning difference or having a physical challenge, that you can sue your district or you can petition for improved conditions. And it meant that public schools could no longer reject students because of a disability. A public school could no longer say, you don't get to come here because of a disability or learning challenge. The federal government assumed some, but not nearly all of the costs. And if you are a state, you probably think the federal government should have picked up a little bit more of its share here. But the federal government did do a bunch of funding to provide education for students who had been previously excluded. 1979, along comes the Department of Education. It's known as the DOED, like D and then little o-E-D, or the ED. And this was created under President Carter as a cabinet-level office. Remember, we saw that video at the beginning where Trump said, ixnay on the Department of Education. Okay? And Rick Perry said, the Department of Education, it's going to go. And he said it, and everyone was so distracted by, you can't remember the third agency, right? That was not a great moment. Hopefully none of you have that moment in your debates this year. But he was distracted by that. No one really even commented on the fact that he said, let's eliminate the Department of Education. Okay? Previously, education had been with health and welfare. And now, there's a separate cabinet level office, the Department of Education, that took a bunch of laws and put them under one unified body. So there were already previous education policies. We've looked at some of them. But they were all administered by different agencies, and this said we need a Department of Education. The effectiveness and the size and the mission of the Department of Education has changed dramatically based on what president is in office. And we'll look sort of where it's headed under Trump. All right, 1983 comes along, and there's this thing called the A Nation at Risk report. And this was a Reagan Commission report. There was an enormous criticism of teachers and the United States education system. And it explicitly said that the United States is losing in education to other countries. Remember, this is still during the Cold War. We're losing out. And that is going to eventually harm American leadership and hegemony if we do not improve our schools. This started the standards movement in education. So if you have ever taken a standardized test as part of your educational process in a public school, it wasn't like the SAT, you have the Nation at Risk report pretty much to thank for sort of that movement. 1990, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act gets reauthorized, and it gets a new name. It gets a new name. The Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA. Congress loves acronyms that then make words that sound like the thing they're talking about. So like, we have an idea, we should educate children. IDEA. It's basically the same as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. And so all the things we talked about, a free and appropriate education, the least restrictive environment, that there are IEPs, that parents are involved in the process, all of that's the same, but it gets a new name. 1994, Clinton is president, and he comes up with this thing called Goals 2000. Goals 2000. And the idea, you all were not around for this, but in the 90s, people really like to talk about the year 2000 because it seemed far away and really exciting. Now it seems far away and not exciting at all. But at the time, everyone was looking forward to this like new millennium. So there were all of these things, both in Congress and just like in society, that were around the year 2000. We're going to like do this thing for 2000. And this was the education one, Goals 2000. And the idea was that the federal government would fund states getting together to sort of standardize curriculum across states. So the problem that they identified is that schooling is really different in different states. And different states had different standards, and if you had a high school graduate from one state and a high school graduate from the other state, you could not guarantee that they knew the same things. It's a problem. Clinton's version of this is very voluntary. He said, states, hey, if you want to get together, we'll pay for it. You can standardize your processes, but it's up to you. Okay? It is a carrot version of this policy. It's like, here's some money. If you're interested, it's yours. If you're not, no biggie. Optional. 1999, and you sort of noticed a trend that these busing policies that started after Brown v. Board were starting to get phased out. This is sort of the death knell for them. In 1999, another Charlotte-Mecklenburg busing situation where the district court said mandatory busing by race is no longer needed. We just don't need to worry about it anymore. And the reason we don't need to worry about